Well, we start a new series. We're going to be studying for 3 months now from 1st and 2nd Kings. It's a little different than Thessalonians. Go back into the Old Testament, and especially we're going to get involved in the life of Solomon and David, the things that happened to David. So much reasoning and forgiveness and love and leadership came out of David's tenure. And now David, when we get to our lesson today, David is getting ready to die, and a new king has to come on the throne. And that's not an easy thing to do. It has to be one of David's sons in order that the lineage continue. Now, we need to settle once and for all, when God called David as the shepherd boy and called him into his kingship ultimately, David was a man of war. And being a man of war, he was not going to be allowed to build the temple. It was not because of his adulterous relationship with Bathsheba that he was not going to build the temple. It was because he was a man of war. Now, Solomon was different. He was not a man of war, as we will see. But David the king so was after the heart of God. I never get far away from that when I talk about David, with all of his difficulties, all of his problems, all of the messes he made for himself. He came to confess those messes that he made because of sin in his life, and God forgave him. And what we're going to study today is one of those amazing stories of the forgiveness of God. You just have to stretch your whole grace concept to imagine God in this situation, forgiving David for what he did, and then using Solomon, who was the son of Bathsheba and David, and using him to become king of Israel, to follow on his father's throne. Now, David, that shepherd boy, as you well know, had a close relationship with Jonathan, the son of Saul. And Saul was the king, and David was the rising king, and Saul became extremely jealous. But a great friendship developed between David and Jonathan Jonathan realized that he would never become king, that David was the chosen one of God. And then God put him on the throne and promised that through him the Messiah would come. And that's what happened when we come to the New Testament, especially in Luke's Gospel chapter 2. It came to pass that the Messiah came, and he was from, well, listen to the story. Came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And this taxing was first made when Cyrenius was governor of Syria. All went to be taxed, every one into his own city. Joseph also went up from Galilee, out of the city of Nazareth, unto Judea, into the city of Bethlehem, into the city of David, which is called Bethlehem because he was of the house and lineage of David. So it was Joseph of the house and lineage of David that went up to be taxed. And so through this came the Messiah of God. And she wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and you know the Christmas story. But all my point is that David the king was a mighty king. He expanded the boundaries beyond anything they'd ever known. Won battle after battle, was absolutely an outstanding soldier, an outstanding musician, an outstanding writer. Many of the Psalms written by David. So now he's going to be hard to replace. And we're going to find that Solomon makes an excellent choice when he comes to replace his father. So if you'll look with me now, please, at 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 4 through 15. 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 4 through 15. This coming to grant the promise that God had offered and that was willing to keep. Now, when we come to look at this, let me give just a little more of the background. Decision making is critical at any level of life. But decision making at the level of life of becoming a king of a vast nation, decision making becomes even more critical. Even in our life, decision making is critical. It is a serious business when we make decisions for God through Jesus Christ by the power of the Holy Spirit. It is a serious decision. It's a serious proposition to serve God. God takes us seriously when we serve Him. And because God takes us seriously, it's because the God who called us into salvation is the God who is going to call us into judgment. And the seriousness of our work and what it means becomes absolutely. But there's a second principle that we need to know. And I said earlier that Solomon was not a man of war. We've had no indication of that. And when Solomon comes to the throne, he has to come to the throne with what he has. For you see, this is the other part of the equation of decision making. We can only serve God with what we have on any given day of our life. We can't serve God with what we don't have or what we think we're going to have. We can only serve God with what we have. For instance, when David went up against Goliath, all he had was a slingshot and some rocks. That's all he had that day. He didn't have all of the power of the nation behind him. He had only a slingshot and some rocks and took down Goliath. Well, you remember in the New Testament in John chapter 6, they're looking for some food and there's a boy there that has a lunch. And Jesus takes the lunch. It wasn't much. Fish, bread. Jesus multiplies it and feeds the flock. But all the little boy had was a lunch, and he used it for Jesus' sake. Just like David used it for God's sake when he killed Goliath. You remember the story of Dorcas. It says, and when he got there, the ladies were crying because of what Dorcas had made for them. All Dorcas had was a sewing kit. But when Dorcas died, they cried because they had lost a friend. So when we get to the decision-making process, we need to take very seriously the understanding we can only serve God with what we have on any given day of our life. And that changes. That changes sometimes from day to day. Now, when we come to this passage, David and Bathsheba and Nathan, the prophet, come to play in the whole scenario of Solomon becoming king. Adonijah, one of his sons, in fact, he was the oldest son of David, tried to become king. And the wind of that got down to Bathsheba and to Nathan. They went immediately to David and said, David, you need to declare what one of your sons is going to be king of Israel. And David had no qualms. It was going to be Solomon. So he made the arrangement for Solomon to be crowned as king. And he instructed Solomon that he was to follow in the path of knowing God and serving God and understanding God and look at the statutes of God and the law of God and following those as well. So Solomon eventually finds himself as king of Israel, and he goes to Gibeon, which is about 7 miles northeast of Jerusalem. He goes there and he sacrifices at the high places. Now, the high places were those places that usually were on a rolling hill or a knob where you could make the sacrifice and be seen by others. And so he goes there to make the sacrifices. And the thing that he does, probably that was as wise as anything in the support. You know, when you've got a kingdom this large, you've got to have lots of support. So he took the entire kingdom and divided it into 12 districts. And each one of those districts was responsible for taking care of the kingdom financially for 1 month. 12 districts, 12 months. That's how Solomon in his reign started off. Very understanding of the needs and what was going to be. Now, here we get back to our text, chapter 3, verses 4 and 5. Chapter 3, verses 4 and 5. And the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for there was a great high place, and he sacrificed 1,000 burnt offerings upon the altar. In Gibeon the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night and asked, "What shall I give thee?" So here's the scenario. He goes up to Gibeon to make the sacrifices. Now these sacrifices are very important. Two kinds of sacrifices. There was the ordinary sacrifice that was laid on the altar, and then there was the peace offering. Now the peace offering normally came in case I forgot something in the first sacrifice. The peace offering came as something that I didn't expect to happen has happened, and now I need to make an offering for that as well. And so the offerings were made at Gibeon. Now, just a word about the Gibeons. You find them in, I think it's the 7th chapter of the book of Joshua. When Israel was coming through and taking the land that God had given them, the Gibeonites did not want to be destroyed. And so they deceitfully disguised themselves. They put on old clothes, old shoes, molded bread, cracked bottles, cracked whatever they had. It looked like they had been carrying it. It was ancient, it was old, it was worn out. They were absolutely desperate and destitute. And so God had said to the Israelites, don't form any alliance. But when they saw what looked like the poverty of the Gibeonites, they did form an alliance and promise that they would not destroy that particular nation, that particular area. Now, when they found out the truth about it all, they assimilated the Gibeonites into Israel, but they made them the workers. They did not let them have places of leadership. And so these Gibeonites were very important, and Gibeon was very important to what had been going on with God. And as a result, this tent of meeting, the part of the tabernacle that was so exciting where God dwelt, the Gibeonites and Israel sacrificed at those places. 1,000 sacrifices. The time of worship, I jotted down, worship of our God is always appropriate, but especially when major decisions are being made, the worship of God is appropriate. This past Easter season that we came through, it was my privilege to preach out at the First Baptist Church of McClenny. And I said to them something that I really remember. I built a sermon on the 2nd chapter of the book of Philippians, which has the idea of the mind of Christ, and the whole controlling passage is the mind of Christ. His attitude, his deportment, the way he thought, the way he governed, his personality. So this attitude. But when I got into that passage and I looked at, he thought himself, though he was equal with God, he thought it not robbery to no longer be equal with God. He took upon himself the form of a servant. Now, when you take upon yourself the form of a servant, you've given up all rights. And I studied that passage and looked at that from every angle until I came to the realization, I'm not going to get to the depth of this passage. All of my exegetical skill has been used. All of my commentaries I have looked at. I've studied it the best I know how to do it. I cannot get to the bottom, to the depth of this idea of the mind of Christ. Let this mind be in you, which was in Jesus. I could not get to the depths of that. And so all I had to do, all I had left, I just stopped. I remember well. I just stopped and thanked God for his blessings and worshiped God there in my study, thanking him for the depth of the passage and for the image it had created in my heart and mind. So this idea of when we're getting ready to make the big decisions, the worship of God is very important for every one of us. And so it comes to David in a dream. Now, it's not unusual for God to use dreams, or it was not unusual then, for God to use dreams to instruct people. You remember he used it to instruct Pharaoh in Egypt, who was apparently a non-believer, but he also used it to instruct Joseph in that same scenario. But one of the great uses of dreams was when he used it with Joseph, who was the earthly father of Jesus. And in the dream, God said, it's okay. It's okay. Mary has not committed adultery. It's okay. And so now Solomon encounters God in a dream. And God asked him the most unusual question. What can I do for you? What do you need more than anything else? Now, in verse 6, we find Solomon at his very best. Solomon said, Thou hast shown unto thy servant David, my father, great mercy, according as he walked before thee in truth, and in righteousness, and in uprightness of heart with thee. For thou hast kept for him this great kindness, but thou hast given him a son to sit on the throne as it is of this day. And now, O Lord my God, thou hast made thy servant king instead of David my father. But I am a little child. I do not know how to go out and to come in. Thy servant in the midst of the people has chosen a great people, cannot number them. Number 9, verse 9 is a key. Give therefore thy servant an understanding heart to judge thy people, that I may discern between good and bad, for who is able to judge this with so great a number of people? And it pleased God. Let me just summarize it. In this dream, God said, What can I do for you? Solomon said, I want to have wisdom in dealing with people and with you. I want to follow you in the righteousness of my Father and his good glory. You've shown your servant David many things, faithfulness. You've shown him favor. You've shown him forgiveness. You've shown my Father many things. I want a wise heart. I want to be wise in dealing with people in the kingdom. I want to walk with God. The idea of walking with God starts back with Enoch. He walked with God, and someone said they walked, and God said, Enoch, you're closer to my house than you are your house. Just come on home with me. And Enoch walked with God. He's the first man who ever walked all the way to the kingdom of God, not going through death. So here was Enoch. Now, Solomon wants to walk with God, and you and I need to have the same perspective of walking with God, the uprightness, the continuation of Solomon's life. I've already mentioned to you this idea of forgiveness. Forgiveness may be one of the greatest needs we have in the church today. And God had forgiven David and Bathsheba, and Nathan had corroborated that. And as a result of that, this is the son now has become king, who came out of the adulterous relationship with David and Bathsheba. Great forgiveness of God. Great forgiveness of God. And so he extols God. He leans on David, his father, and his kingship and what he'd been able to do, and I want to do the same thing. You cannot number the people that are in the nation of Israel, said. It's so large. Now, one of the interesting things that absolutely piqued my understanding, and something I really want to try to say and give you an understanding about as well. When Solomon has this dream and God says, what do you want? And he says, I want an understanding heart. God was pleased. That's what he asked for. And he's going to go on in the story to say, I'm pleased you did not ask for great victory. I'm pleased you did not ask for great riches. And God says to Solomon something that absolutely intrigues me. I want you to know, Father, that I don't know how to be a king. I don't know. I'm like a little child. I don't know how to be a king. And the one thing we have to remember, a child is a child and should be treated like a child. A child has no right to run the family. Absolutely none. And so as a result, he said, I want to be a learner of how to be a king. And God was so impressed with his impressions of Solomon and what he desired in his own heart. God said, I'm going to give you 3 bonuses as a result of your answer, Your answer is, I want an understanding heart. You're going to get that, but I'm also going to make you very rich. You're going to have more than you've ever had. You're going to have more than you could ever use. I am going to allow you to build the temple. I'm going to give you the right of making alliance with Hiram. I'm going to help you build the temple. Number 3, I'm going to let you live a long life. I'm going to let you live a long life. So three bonuses. I'm going to make you rich. I'm going to make you famous. I'm going to give you a long life. He had not asked for any of those 3. Now here's my point. And this came to me so clearly when I was studying the passage. God always gives us more than we ask for. We may not understand it at the moment. But God always, when we are right, when we are honest, when we are clean with God, when we are living like forgiven people, when we're walking with God as we should, God always gives us more than we ask for. The great blessing of God that comes. I hope we'll remember that the next time. I hope we'll remember that God gives us more than we ever ask for. He gives us more than we ever could dream. So we are designed as Christians to know and to understand the forgiveness and the blessings of God. Now, this understanding heart that he receives is a heart of discernment. Now, discernment can mean and does mean, and he mentioned here, I can tell the difference between good and bad. I can discern good and bad. And that's what God wanted him to do. And so in understanding the good and the bad, God was pleased with Solomon and commended him. He had not asked for riches. He had not asked for fame. He had not asked for a long life. And God gave all of those to him as well. The gifts and the talents which God gives to us, we use for his glory. Now, in this idea of the gifts and the talents and the special challenges that came to Solomon, Solomon awoke out of the dream and realized that God had spoken to him. And he came back to Jerusalem. He came to Jerusalem and stood before the ark. Listen to verse 15, chapter 3, verse 15. And Solomon awoke, and behold, it was a dream. He came to Jerusalem and stood before the ark of the covenant of God, offered up burnt offerings, offered peace offerings, made a feast of all of his servants. all of his servants. Now, when we know and understand what Solomon is doing in trying to get a handle on how to be a king, discernment is such key. And he makes this offering before the Ark of the Covenant. Now, David had brought the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem, where it belonged. The Ark of the Covenant was a very vital part of the worship of Israel. And that wherever they went, no one was to touch it except those God confirmed that they could and would touch it to move it. The Bible assures us that when we serve God and when we are the people of God that we need to be, God's going to use us and speak to us as well. Now, out of this comes Solomon's first test of how to be a king and how to use the discernment that God has given him. And in this discernment that God has given him, you're going to find in the continuing story, we'll not study it in depth, that two women come to him with one child. One child has died, and the other woman has claimed this woman's child to be her child. And the interesting scenario of how he, in his newfound wisdom of God, made that decision of discernment. Finally came down to the bottom of the story is that he said, give me a sword and I'll cut the baby in half. You can have half and she can have half. The real mother said, oh no, I don't want that. And the other woman seemed satisfied with it. So he discerned this is the real mother of the child who does not want the child killed. So the discernment that comes. Well, I hope as we get into 1 Kings and 2 Kings and as we see the stories of Solomon and all that goes on in his life, we're going to be disappointed in how he turns out. I can tell you that now. He starts off well, but then he misses the mark. And we'll get to that. God bless you. Thanks for watching.